1871. An English logician obsessed with mathematics. An Austrian professor fed up with imperial bureaucracy. A French engineer turned economist. 3 men, 3 countries, no contact between them. And all 3, almost simultaneously, have the same idea. This is no minor coincidence. It is one of the most extraordinary simultaneous discoveries in the history of the social sciences. William Stanley Jevons in England, Carl Menger in Austria, and Leon Walras in Switzerland independently reached the same conclusion: the value of things does not depend on the labor it takes to produce them. It depends on how useful the last unit you consume turns out to be. That seemingly simple idea destroyed the classical theory of value, disarmed the theoretical basis of Marx, and rebuilt all of economics from scratch. So far we have seen 2 ways of understanding the economy. The classicals said value comes from labor. Marx took that idea to its ultimate consequences and concluded that capitalism is exploitation. Today we see the third path. The marginalists did not argue with Marx about ethics or politics. They simply changed the question. Instead of asking how much labor it costs to produce something, they asked how much satisfaction consuming it gives someone. It seems like a minor difference. It is not. It changed the entire discipline. To understand why the marginalist revolution matters, let us return to a problem the classicals never solved well. Water is essential for life. Without water we die in 3 days. A diamond is a dispensable luxury. Nobody dies from lack of diamonds. And yet, a diamond is worth thousands of times more than a glass of water. Why? If value depends on total utility, water should be worth more than a diamond. If it depends on labor, the answer does not fit well either, because there are minerals that take a lot of labor to extract and are worth little. The classicals got tangled up in this paradox. Adam Smith mentioned it without resolving it. Ricardo sidestepped it. Marx ignored it. The marginalists solved it with one word: margin. The key is not how much total utility water provides. It is how much utility the next glass of water provides. If you are dying of thirst in a desert, the first glass of water is worth everything you have. The second is still very valuable. The third, quite a lot. The 10th, somewhat less. Glass number 100, when you are already sated and the bathtub is full, is worth practically nothing. That is diminishing marginal utility. Each additional unit of a good gives you less satisfaction than the one before. Now think about diamonds. Most people do not have any. If you are offered one, the jump from 0 to 1 is huge. The marginal utility of a diamond is high because there are so few. Water has immense total utility. But because there is so much of it, the marginal utility of one more glass is minimal. Diamonds have modest total utility. But because they are scarce, the marginal utility of one more is high. Price does not reflect total utility. It reflects marginal utility. And marginal utility depends on the quantity available. Paradox solved. What is fascinating is how 3 people arrived at this same idea by completely different paths. William Stanley Jevons was English, the son of a Liverpool merchant who went bankrupt. He studied logic and chemistry in London, worked several years at the Sydney Mint, and returned to England convinced that economics needed mathematics. His theory of political economy of 1871 presented marginal utility as a mathematical function that could be calculated, graphed, and optimized. Carl Menger was Austrian, a lawyer by training, a journalist by trade, and deeply suspicious of mathematics and economics. His Principles of Economics, also from 1871, reached similar conclusions but with a completely different approach. For Menger, value is subjective. It is not a property of the good but of the mind of the person valuing it. And mathematics cannot capture that subjectivity. Leon Walras was French, the son of an economist and an engineer by training. He took the marginalist idea further than anyone. In 1874 he published his Elements of Pure Economics, where he built a mathematical model of an entire economy. All markets connected. All prices being determined simultaneously. Everything in equilibrium. This is what we now call general equilibrium. Imagine a system where the price of bread affects the price of flour, which affects the price of wheat, which affects farmers' wages, which affects how much bread they can buy. Walras attempted to capture that entire web of connections in equations. It is the mathematical foundation of modern economics. If Jevons, Menger, and Walras lit the fire, Alfred Marshall built the fireplace. Marshall was a professor at Cambridge. Brilliant and meticulous. In 1890 he published his Principles of Economics, which became the dominant textbook for 40 years. And what he did was extraordinarily skillful. He fused classical ideas with marginalist ones. His most famous metaphor is Marshall's scissors. The price of a good is not determined by supply alone, as the classicals said, nor by demand alone, as the marginalists emphasized. It is determined by both. Like the two blades of a pair of scissors. There is no point asking which blade cuts the paper. Both are necessary. Marshall also introduced concepts that are taught in first-year economics courses around the world: the elasticity of demand, consumer and producer surplus, and the short run and long run as distinct analytical frameworks. The economics taught in universities today is, in large part, Marshall's economics. We call it neoclassical economics, because it fuses the classicals with the marginalists. The Marginalist Revolution has undeniable achievements. It solved the paradox of value that the classicals could not solve. It provided mathematical tools that made economics a more rigorous discipline. Supply and demand analysis, consumer theory, the theory of the firm, everything we saw in the parts on microeconomics, comes directly from here. But the marginalists also made mistakes. Or more precisely, they made assumptions that turned out to be problematic. First, they assumed consumers are rational. That they calculate costs and benefits, maximize their utility, and make coherent decisions. As we will see in the final episode of this part, that is not true. Human beings are predictably irrational. Second, Walras's general equilibrium is an elegant mathematical construction, but it assumes perfect markets, complete information, and perfect competition. The real world does not work that way. There are monopolies, asymmetric information, externalities, public goods. The marginalists themselves knew these were problems. But the temptation of a clean, elegant model led many later economists to treat the exceptions as rare cases when in reality they are the norm. Third, by centering economics on mathematics and individual decisions, the marginalists lost sight of the questions of power, institutions, and distribution that concerned both the classicals and Marx. Economics became more rigorous, but also narrower. The Marginalist Revolution seems abstract. Marginal utility, general equilibrium, supply and demand curves. But it has very concrete consequences for people's lives. If value is subjective and determined by the market, then the market price is, by definition, the fair price. There is no exploitation in the Marxist sense, because the wage a worker accepts reflects the marginal utility of his labor to the employer. If you do not like the wage, find another job. This logic has undeniable elegance. And also an enormous blind spot: it assumes that workers have real choices. That the labor market is competitive. That there are no power asymmetries between someone who needs to eat tomorrow and someone who can wait. The marginalist tools are powerful. But like any tool, they can be used well or badly. They can illuminate how markets work, or they can be used to justify any outcome the market produces, however unjust. 3 ideas to take away from this episode. First, the marginalists solved the paradox of value. Price does not reflect total utility or the labor invested, but the utility of the last unit consumed. Marginal utility, combined with scarcity, explains prices. Second, 3 economists independently arrived at the same idea in 1871. Jevons with mathematics, Menger with subjectivism, Walras with general equilibrium. Marshall synthesized them. Together they created the neoclassical economics taught today. Third, the marginalists made economics more rigorous but also more abstract. They assumed perfect rationality, perfect markets, and complete information. Those assumptions are useful as a starting point but describe a world that does not exist. Marginalism gave economics powerful tools. But one branch of the marginalist tree grew in a very different direction. In Vienna, a group of economists took the idea that value is subjective and carried it to a radical conclusion: if knowledge is dispersed across millions of minds, no central planner can replace the market. The Austrians were not just arguing with Marx. They were arguing with anyone who believed the government can manage an economy. And their strongest argument was not ideological. It was logical. That, next time.